right, we are back with session 3 with Dr. Ray Mondragon. He's talking about Genesis and science. And this is our last session of the webinar today. For those of you who are still hanging on, we appreciate that. We thank you. It's been a long day. I don't know of anybody who's been on the entire thing as it's gone across the world, but this has been really good. I want to point you, we'll make sure that we put links to the ISBH website where these videos are going to be in a repository eventually. And want to make sure that you check out forhisglorynm.com and so that you can see more of Dr. Ray's stuff. Now, I see in your bio that you have a background in engineering. Actually, you have your bachelor in civil engineering, and you spent a lot of years as an engineer in one way or another. How has that contributed to your understanding or how you see science, especially from a biblical standpoint?
Well, in engineering, you start off with a lot of science, back in school, but you utilize science and scientific principles throughout your engineering career if you're actually doing design and that sort of thing. If you're not, other than management and that kind of area of engineering, but so that's where you kind of come from. So you begin to think in terms of how do things work and how does it fit with the Bible? I mean, so you begin as a Christian to think through, well, there's got to be a correlation here. So you think through the whole evolutionary thing that you've heard, and that doesn't make sense. So you start to investigate it. So basically the short answer is, I guess pretty early on as a believer, I began to think in terms of science and scripture, and then came across creation science. So I've been studying creation science for 35 years or so.
So as a civil engineer, do you see an engineer at work in chapter 1 here?
Oh, absolutely.
You see an engineer's mind here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, go ahead and share with us. Let's pick up where we left off, because I can't wait to hear how this story continues to unfold.
All righty. Let me switch to the screen here. Yeah, that comes right out of my background, basically, in terms of understanding Genesis, understanding science, and how the two fit together. And you have to sort through a lot of your mainly high school. Engineers don't get into the biology aspect, so we don't get into a lot of the evolution stuff. You're aware of it and you've heard it, and because that's all you hear in the culture. But eventually you begin to think, well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit here. That didn't fit this, and it forces you to kind of think through some of these things. So an engineering background is very good for background in biblical studies. In fact, I'm not good at languages or the humanities. That was always a weakness. That's a lot of engineers. They go into engineering because numbers are easier for them, and things that you can visualize, like things in science, are easier. So the humanities are more difficult. But just as part of what you introduced this with, when I studied the original languages, it was a huge obstacle. I felt like I could barely speak English, much less Greek or Hebrew. What am I going to do here? Until it clicked. Studying languages, Greek and Hebrew, the type of study is very similar to that you study in the sciences. It's detailed, it's attention to the minutia, the little detail. You study one page in physics in a chapter. So once that kind of clicked in my mind, it didn't make it any easier, but it helped me to figure out how to study biblical languages. So anyway, there was a direct correlation there. So let's get into Genesis 1 again. And again, this is the third part. And my intention is not to get through the entire chapter. What I'm trying to do is just give you a picture of how to approach Genesis in light of the scientific community that we find ourselves in, and in terms of technical people and all of the debates and all that. And you don't have to have a science background. In fact, sometimes a science background will cloud your thinking because you're constantly trying to impose that on the biblical text. That's why I started off with that illustration of having your 12-year-old son or daughter explain the text to you, and you'll have a better understanding than if you ask a PhD in science. So the text is not complicated. The text is fairly straightforward. So you let it speak for itself. When it says water, probably means water. When it says day, it probably means day, you know, that sort of thing. Let the text speak, and then you can take whatever area, science or whatever other area, and fit it into the early chapters of Genesis. So let's take a look, first of all, at day one. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the structure, but each of the days follow kind of a structure, which is not unusual for historical narrative. Historical narrative has structure and it utilizes different structures. Poetic material is different, but we have a structure within a structure here. We have each day, you have revelation, God speaking. In fact, all of the creative acts are introduced by God said, so God speaks. And by the way, when God created, Colossians 1 tells us he created things visible and invisible. The stress of Genesis 1 are those things that are visible and material. But when it says God said, you could go and study that in more detail or think about it in more detail and realize that we have communication in Genesis 1, God speaking. I'll touch on that a little bit more. Secondly, we have the divine fiat. Let there be such and such, or God created such and such. We have a divine fiat, a creative description. And very importantly, we have, and it was so. In other words, fulfillment or words to that effect. Day one is let there be light, and there was light, or it was so. But the literal words is there was light, a fulfillment. So you have fulfillment. And notice we talked about a polemic. It's not after millions and millions of years, it's immediacy of fulfillment. So we have kind of a contradiction to evolutionary thinking there. And then you have an action. God names it. God, in terms of the lights, he places them. And there's not in every day, but in some of the days you might have some action. The ones with the asterisks are characteristic of every one of the 6 days of creative work. The ones without, like the action, some of them there's no action. Some of them are blessed, so God blesses them. You might have a blessing. You have an evaluation. It was good. And again, not every day, but some of the days it was good. But then you have the final evaluation. It was very good in verse 31 after the completion of the 6 creative days. And then you have a terminus. It was evening and it was morning, one day or day 2, etc. So you have the ending. This is the basic structure. So on day 1, you might say, if you look at it, just from God speaking, and you have an effect of that speaking, you might have the invisible concept, but one that is observable by science is you might have the beginning of cause and effect. Then God said something, let there be light, and there was light. Cause and effect. And you're going to see this over and over. And this is a fundamental aspect of the natural realm. In fact, after the completion of creation, that will start the universe on a path of continuous cause and effect throughout the history of the universe. So if you want to look at it from a scientific perspective, you have cause and effect. You have revelation, you have God communicating, God said, Vav consecutive, and God said. You have the origin of language here. I noticed one of the talks was on language. I'm not sure what was discussed there. Hopefully the speaker went to Genesis 1 because we have the origin of language. And again, language doesn't come from man, doesn't come from grunts and pointing at objects, but God communicates. The origin of language, in fact, the origin of everything is God himself. We have the origin of language. And if you get to verse 26, there seems to be an intra-Trinitarian communication because God seems to be speaking. And he, in verse 26, let us make man in our image, us and our. So there's seems to be something going on there. Again, we don't have a full-fledged Trinity, but probably the best understanding theologically of that is this intra-Trinitarian idea. We also have the power of his word. He speaks things into existence. The means is his word. God said. Now, elsewhere, Psalm 33, 6 through 9 kind of expands upon that. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. So we have a means of creation. Again, if you want to look at it from a science perspective, you have lots of means, lots of causes, and lots of effects in scientific study. It's through the word that God creates. And by the breath. Now this is poetry. So you have synonymous poetry here. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. That's line 1. Then you have a parallel statement that basically says the same thing, rephrasing it. That's a characteristic of Hebrew poetry. You don't have that characteristic in Genesis 1. And so kind of the same idea, and by the breath of his mouth, all their host. And then again, if you skip down to verse 9, for he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. So the means of God's creation is his word. He uses wisdom. There's some passages that indicate that. Display of power, creates by power. There's other verses that we could look at, but we're focusing on science. In a way, not so much directly related, but language. In fact, science utilizes language. We utilize language to formulate statements of science. We have the beginnings of language here. God communicates. He's not silent. The means of creation, so significant. God speaks it into creation. So language is not trivial. And by the way, language is not neutral either. It's not trivial. It's not neutral. The origin of language is not man. It's God. And then we have God giving categories, God names. He's setting up categories. This is one of the things that we do in language. This is what linguists do. They set up categories of thoughts, of ideas, of nouns. But categories don't start with linguists. They start with God naming, God identifying. And this sets a foundation for the first biologist of Scripture. Adam is given the task of naming the animals. In order to name the animals, Adam has to understand the characteristics and the distinctions between all of the different animals that God creates. And he puts them in these biological categories by naming them. But that characteristic comes from God, and man created in the image of God. God is the originator of this concept of naming or establishing categories. So it's built into man. Man doesn't evolve to grunts, pointing, and then nouns, and then verbs. But God builds into man from the very beginning the ability to communicate back, the ability to speak. So it's the basis of communication, not rationalism. Basis of science, not naturalism, is language and communication and identification. So we have Elohim, he's the focus. He's the one that acts throughout. He's the creator. The word bara is used 4 places here. Verse 1, 21, verse 27, chapter 2, verse 3. God speaks, God said, introducing each of the creative days. In fact, a couple of the days he speaks twice, and God said 2 times. God separates, chapter 4, God makes. This is the other creative word, asa, in verse 7, verse 16, verse 25. Again, asa, the Hebrew word in chapter 2, verse 3. God placed the heavenly bodies, verse 17. So God is active, acting. He's personal. God involved in the creative process. So all of these have implications in terms of science, because once the creation is set up, now man is in a position to be able to observe the product of what God has done and to make choices concerning that creation and conduct a life within that creation. In fact, if we had time, we could look at verse 28, where I think implied in the creation mandate or the dominion mandate, part of that, I see the roots of the whole scientific endeavor. And then again, the last thing here, God blesses, verse 22, and then that verse in 28. So it's a hands-on work. God is immanent. In chapter 2, God gets his hands dirty. He gets his hands into the soil, you might say, and creates man out of the dust or the earth or the dirt, hands-on ministry. So we have the beginning of cause and effect with the means of creation, God speaking, origin of language, science, and technology. We have the work of God, not naturalism. So origins is based in what God has done, not naturalism. We have the creation of light, the Hebrew word aor, light. So we have the beginnings of all energy. Light is energy. The most basic energy of all is light energy. So I think behind light, God is instilling in this mass of water energy, beginning with light energy. And, you know, we as scientists, we can measure it. It's measurable. And here's the speed of light, 186,282.397 to 3 digits, miles per second. That's what science does. It observes what God has done. So God has created something that is observable, and he's built into man certain abilities to be able to make measurements on the creation. And there's different views in terms of what God created. Is this God's light? Because God is light. I prefer that. I think he's building primarily the physical realm, and I think God is creating physical light. Now the question comes up, how does that fit in, since the sun and the moon are not created until day 4? What is this light? Some say, well, it must be God's light. Well, I think he has built physical light, and there's other forms of light other than the light that comes from the sun. In fact, fire produces light, electricity produces light, nuclear reactions produce light. So light in itself is separate from the light bearers. Another reason why they're identified in day 4 as light bearers. They're a means or a source of light, but I think God is creating early on the entire electromagnetic spectrum. which light is just a small portion of it. In fact, the graph there gives you an indication of the spectrum in logarithmic form, and light is a small portion of that. So there are gamma rays, there's X-rays, there's ultraviolet light, there's microwave light, even radio waves could be considered part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And I think on day one, when God creates light, he starts the basic beginnings of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. This is just another view of visible light to kind of give you the proportion there of visible light that we can detect. And God has built us to be able to observe that visible light, but there's other forms that go beyond what we can observe. So I think what he's doing here is building the physical light that other areas will be utilized in science. So different sources, chemical reactions will produce light, thermal reactions can produce light, nuclear reactions, electrical, and then the sun itself, which is actually a nuclear fission process. Supernatural light, God uses it. I think I'll skip over this to get further. Just examples of God using light apart from the sun. Lots of examples in scripture. So it's not tied, light is not tied to the sun. So the electromagnetic spectrum on day one. We also have what I just mentioned a while ago, the immediacy. It was so the fulfillment, no long ages, long periods of creative action, which goes against a very common compromised view, I believe, progressive creationism, very popular today, probably more popular than the viewpoint that we take of a literal 6-day creation. And evidence for that is in the biblical text. The biblical text seems to stress because it has this element in the days of creation, not just once. We also have a divine evaluation. It was good, which tells us that something happened to that very good creation, because we could not legitimately state that the creation we're living in today is very good. There's some evil elements incorporated in it. So in terms of the usages of the days of creation, we could spend time on that because that's a major area of controversy, particularly with those that hold to an old earth. There's a hermeneutical principle of the law of first use, which you see most often in the book of Genesis, not so much so later on, but sometimes in the book of Genesis when Moses is using a concept that is very, very important, he seems to give some explanation or definition, the law of first use. I think Genesis 1:5 is such an example. God called the light day. Now he's using a particular word here, yom, and there's a light portion to the day, and the darkness he called night. So he's distinguishing. He's setting up a category of a portion of the day that's characterized by light, and a portion of the day that's characterized by night. And then if that's not clear enough, there was evening, another element of the day, and there was morning, which is, again, another characteristic. And then he identifies, that is what I mean when I say one day. And you're going to have a repetition of there was evening and there was morning, and then you have day two. So I think Moses could not have been clearer in what he intended, and we could spend a whole session on the word yom and how it's used in scripture thousands of times. and argue from even Genesis 1 that God intended to convey the idea of a solar or approximately a 24-hour day. And he seems to define it in verse 5. And by the way, had Moses intended to speak in terms of each day representing long periods of time, there are two other Hebrew words that Moses uses, one of them in Genesis 3, olam, which has the idea of something extended, something long. In terms of time, it would be long periods of time, or in terms of distance, long distance. Moses could have used olam, but he uses yom, which refers to a specific time frame of about 24 hours. Here's the available terms. There's olam, and there's also arek, which also is a synonym. And Moses uses this also in the book of Genesis. He uses it in Deuteronomy. So he was familiar with two terms that he could have used had he intended long periods of time. So on day one, we have the origin of optics. That's a branch of physics. The origin of the electromagnetic spectrum, if you want to think scientifically. We have immediacy of fulfillment, not long periods of time. And we even have the origin of a time frame itself. And this time frame is not dependent on the sun. So a time frame transcends the solar system. There's a time frame that is, from God's perspective, that is not dependent on the sun and the moon, because we already have a measurement of time in terms of one day. And putting together a lot of these arguments, you could also even conclude that we have evidence in day one of a young Earth, some of the things that we've already discussed. So that's day one. Let's take a look at the second day. And I won't spend too much time on it. I think Paul talked about the expanse. And I trust that he gave us an idea concerning that word. The Hebrew word rakia, it has a particular usage. The noun or the verb form has the idea of, it comes from everyday speaking. It was used in a context of metallurgy, where you would beat out a piece of metal, silver, gold, bronze, whatever, and you would beat it out such that it would spread out thinly. So you might say what God is doing here is he is spreading out thinness, you might say, on day two. In fact, I should read the text. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So you have some interesting phenomenon here. An expanse. Now, I think historically, there's been kind of some confusion over the meaning of that word, and I think it was introduced primarily with the King James Version that translates it into firmament. But I would steer away from that kind of idea of this idea of something solid. I don't think it has that idea at all. It has more this spread out thinness, or expanse would be a good translation. The question is, what is it referring to? Is it referring to the atmosphere, and or is it referring to space? I would think that it's referring to space. What about the waters that are separated here? The waters are separated. Then God said in verse 6, well, I read that one, verse 7, and God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse. So we have something underneath the expanse, whatever that expanse is, whatever this thinness is. Below it, there are waters that are separated from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. Now, some commentators say that what we have is a separation of the atmospheric waters from the oceans or the waters on Earth. The waters above would be atmospheric in the form of clouds, and then the liquid water in the form of oceans. I think the better view, the more straightforward understanding of the biblical text is there's a separation, because when you get further in, it's going to talk about the birds of the heaven occupying this expanse. And that would be, in that context, a reference to the expanse closer to the earth or the atmosphere. But then later on day 4, it talks about the lights and the stars also within the expanse. So we're talking about something way beyond the earth, and probably the better view is that at the edge of the universe, we would expect to observe oceans or waters of some sort, of who knows how thick of waters. So God is separating the waters from the earth, which we would include oceans, and waters that would be at the edge of the universe. And by the way, astrophysicists, I don't know if there of a single one that thinks that we have observed the edge of the universe, which leads some of them to think that it is infinite or unlimited. But scriptures tells us that there's some limitations, and at the outer limitation is probably a blanket, you might say, or a sphere of water that encompasses all of the universe that we can observe. This stretching idea is a very common theme in Scripture. For example, Psalm 104, verse 2, where, now this is poetry, so you have imagery, and you have parallelism, covering yourself with light as with a cloak, referring to God, stretching out heaven like a tent curtain. That's this idea that we have in Genesis, this stretching out of heaven. In fact, some physicist believers that have studied this passage and take a biblical worldview view the universe as not being a vacuum, but having something like a fabric to it, something that you can stretch, something that's stretchable, you might say. Isaiah 44:24, thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, the one who formed you from the womb, I, the Lord, am the maker of all things. So God is the creator. And notice a reference to day 2, stretching out the heavens by myself and spreading out the earth all along. This idea of stretching. Isaiah 48:3, surely my hand founded the earth, another reference to the creation. And again, God is the one, God is the speaker, capitalization of my, and my right hand spread out the heavens. And by the way, these are not the only verses. There's others as well that speak of this spreading out idea. In the last part there, when I called to them, they stand together. In other words, I sovereignly work and they respond under my sovereign control. Jeremiah 51:15, it is he who made the earth. Again, reference to creation, by his power. Not only did he speak, not only by his word, but by his power. Here's one of the verses I alluded to earlier. Who established the world by his wisdom. So omnipotent power and divine wisdom was involved in the creation, and by his understanding, in other words, the utilization of knowledge, he stretched out the heavens. And there's other verses as well. Isaiah 40:22, 42:5, Zechariah 12:1, Job 26:7. So if you want to make a comparison with the chronology in the 6 days of creation, in contrast to evolution. If we had more time, we could kind of add to this chart, but you see that there's no consistency. That's why I would reject evolution and take Genesis as the priority. As I go through this, I can go through that chart and it ends up with a bowl of spaghetti, basically. So we have the stretching out of space, and we could say that on day 2, we have the origin of astrophysics. So if you study astrophysics, this is a starting point. Now you want to start with Genesis 1:1, but you have a little bit of a focus on astrophysics on day 2. You have the possibility, the text is not clear, that in this stretching out, because there seems to be some characteristics like a fabric there could be the possibility of material being stretched out, water, more than likely, that God will transform into different elements. So that's possible. The other possibility is that God builds within this space or this universe particular heavenly bodies and all of the particles that you can find within space. So possibility of material being spread along with what is described as an expanse. We have a separating of a water mass, and you might say we have the origin of oceanography. So if you want to study oceanography, day 2 is another day to focus some attention on. So that's day 2. I'm wondering if I want to jump ahead at all. Well, let's see how far we get. 3rd day, land and plant animals. I think I'll go through this quickly. Let's see, let me jump ahead here. I think I duplicated something here. Okay, here we go. Okay, day 3, beginning of verse 9. There's the land mass. Again, we could talk about geophysics and what we have here. There's a theory that perhaps God created one continent. This is kind of based on when we get to Genesis 6 through 9 and we talk about the Genesis flood. There's a creationist view that seems to indicate that perhaps this Pangea or this single landmass, it just talks about land when it talks about the earth. Then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. So God gathers the oceans, and let the dry land appear. So now we have the first mention of the dry land. And it seems to be together, or it seems to be unified in some way. And we have the fulfillment, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called sea. So he's identifying different categories again and distinguishing oceans from land masses. And then he gets into the ideas of the plants. So how do you take this land mass? There's a couple of ways, perhaps. Remember, all we have that is mentioned is water, hydrogen and oxygen forming water. And perhaps it's at this point that God transforms some of the water molecules into the various other molecules that we have throughout, and elements that we have throughout land masses. That's a possibility. I don't think the text specifies one way or the other. Or perhaps there's a pre-existing land under the waters that God also created originally that has all of the elements, because the text seems to indicate that now the land masses, at least it seems, possibly comes to the surface because it says, let the dry land appear. So that may be a hint that there's land under the water that comes now and is on the surface. So it doesn't tell us. The flood gives us some more information concerning tectonics and that sort of thing. Well, I think rather than talking about the next creative part, we also have on day 3 the creation of plant life. Then God said, verse 11, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind. We have the first biological structures in terms of botany, you might say, or plant life. And if you study the terms, you have very general categories. Perhaps the first term, dese, vegetation perhaps in general, and then 2 subcategories under that. Another Hebrew category of herbage in general, or plant life on more of a broad basis. And then you also have a distinction between fruit trees, in other words, seed-bearing plants. So very, very broad categories. But the important note in there is plants after their kind. And beginning here, if we had more time, we can see that polemic aspect in terms of a polemic against any form of evolution. There are a lot of little details that we could look at, but we're getting close to the end of our session here. So I think what I will do is jump ahead and bring us to a little bit of a conclusion here. Let's see, what do I want to say here? Yeah, let me conclude day 3, and that's a good place to stop. So on day 3, we have the origin of geophysics, including tectonics, origin of botany and genetics on Earth. So we have the foundation for many sciences, all science, I think, in the 6 days of creation. We have built-in reproductive systems, which is different from evolution, and boundaries in those reproductive systems such that they don't cross boundaries, no evolution from one species to another. Origin of food and oxygen factories, that's plant life. They're actually food and plant factories. Vegetation before sunlight, which goes against evolution. And we have fruit trees before animals. And remember, fruit trees require insects for pollination, and this goes totally against that concept. And we have the fixity of kinds. Everything is built after their kind. We'll see that also in zoology when we have the creation of animals. Well, why don't we stop there? What I wanted to do, my intention was not to get through all of Genesis 1. I didn't know how far I would get. My intention was mainly just to show you that if you just take the words of the text and let them speak on their own, a biblical worldview does not allow science to supersede or be imposed over the biblical text. Let the biblical text guide you. God is in the process of developing all of these areas of science. So everything that you have in Genesis 1 is not necessarily what we have today. So we can't impose scientific theories today upon Genesis 1 because we have a very different creation in Genesis 1 than what we have today. But we have the origin of the studies of, in this case, on day 3, geophysics, botany, genetics, and some of the aspects of botany and other areas as well. So let me turn it back over to Daniel, and we'll conclude our day.
Well, that was really good. I wish I could hear the rest of it, because I'm sure there are a whole lot more questions that we could ask as you go through the other days. Let me pick up on something that you just said there. Over the creation week, or at least the first 3 days, God was developing the sciences, developing the different things. And in a previous session, you had said that even the second law of thermodynamics didn't even come into effect until after the fall. Are there other, I don't know, sciences, are there other categories of science that you see changing as time goes on, maybe after the fall, maybe after the flood? What are maybe high level, what are some of those other things that you would say are absolutely different post-fall or post-flood that we should look out for?
Probably the main thing is anthropology. Man himself. We were radically different before the before the fall.
Mm-hmm.
Anthropology. We have a fallen nature now, which is radically different from what Adam and Eve had. And there's a lot of physical things that took place biologically in mankind. Even Genesis 3 tells us that. Remember, the woman now has pain, an indication of the second law, by the way, in childbearing. It doesn't refer to the man, but we would expect that similar biological changes took place in man. And then after the flood, remember the ages, something radically happened such that the ages of mankind after the flood are radically different. And they descend in an exponential curve, essentially, to some level of near 100 and below that as time went on. So biologically, the whole system, something radically took place at the flood, and obviously before that, something radical took place at the fall of mankind. So even when it comes to man himself, anthropologically, we are very different than not only the original creation, but the period between the fall and the Genesis flood.
So you think there's a lot of something very environmental, at least at the flood, obviously, but even maybe at the fall, that has changed how we would do science today versus back then?
Yes. In other words, if you lived in that period and you conducted an experiment, you would get I think you would get radically different results than if you did it after the flood, for example.
I have to say that of all of the times that I've heard Genesis 1 taught, and especially Genesis 1:3, God said, "Let there be light." Of course, you already addressed, how could it be light without the sun? Is it God's light or whatever? I think that this might be the first time that I've heard anyone say that it was the entire light spectrum. I don't know that I've ever thought of that before. And I just thought that was a really cool picture, because as God is setting up, like you said, the laws of nature, the sciences and everything. At what point did he create energy? And I've heard it put that way before, where he created energy on the third day, but from a spectrum. I think you might have been the first one that I've ever heard put it that way. And I thought that was just fantastic.
Well, if you hear anything unique, you better check it out, because it's probably heresy.
No, it's not doctrinal. Just the term spectrum I thought was really cool.
Good.
When it comes, let me ask this. When it comes to the stretching out, you spent some time on the stretching out on day 2. Of course, the King James did firmament, and that came from the Latin firmamentum. And so, that goes back, several hundred years, 1,000 years. Do you, and you didn't address this, and so I don't mean to catch you off guard maybe, but the concept of apparent age, just in all of creation, or especially when it comes to us being able to see things in space that are too far away, that light shouldn't, have reached here by now.
Yes.
Could you address that a little bit? Is that part of the stretching out, or is that something else?
Absolutely. In fact, I would refer your viewers to a book that was written by Russ Humphreys. He's a nuclear physicist. He's the one that I referred to earlier. He's got a book, Starlight and Time, and he gives some detail to that. And basically, he makes a good case that what you actually have in this stretching out, you have the results of the scientific theory of relativity that Einstein came up with. And when you accelerate materials, lots of strange things take place. And when you approach the speed of light, and you're talking about this stretching out taking place in a very short period of time, things at the other end of the stretching seem to go a lot faster, maybe billions of years in terms of, if you could measure it, in terms of in relationship to what happens on Earth. So what we have in Genesis 1 is what's happening on planet Earth. And Russ Humphreys kind of explains a little bit of the science on that. So this stretching out certainly does involve acceleration of something, even perhaps particles or material or elements that would have some of the actions of that theory of relativity, or time and speed of light interact in strange ways that are different than what we observe on planet Earth. So yeah, I think it does have implications in terms of the age of the Earth, and Russ Humphreys does probably the best job that I know of trying to correlate that. Now, he's the first one to say, this is a theory, this is my idea. This is not what the text says. It just says that God stretched out. And that's what your 12-year-old son or daughter will tell you.
Sort of like Play-Doh, right? Or
yeah.
You know, silly putty, right? You stretch it out and put an imprint on it, right? Cool. I love the fact that you, early on in this session, you talked about that God was the one who created language, and he did it specifically so that he could communicate. You know, God is so infinite and we are so finite, and you had talked about his transcendence. How does a God so far above and beyond us, how does he communicate in a way that we can understand? And we tend to think of language as a Genesis 11 construct, but you brought it all the way back to Genesis 1. And
yes.
would you take a minute and come back to that? I think that's a great way to end our session, with how God has chosen to communicate with us.
Well, he created language because he's the source of it. He's personal, so he communicates, and he's built in the image of God. He built in man the ability to communicate, and primarily to communicate back with him. But once sin entered, now language is also perverted, in that we have lies introduced. In other words, falsehood. When God speaks, God does not lie. So at the fall, we have the introduction of falsehood by, obviously, Satan himself, and the potential within man to misuse language and abuse it. And then when we come to Babel, we have the creation of languages, multiple languages that were not there in the original creation. So we have the unfolding of a plan of God, of how God's working in terms of what we have today. But you see the progress. So that's a further degeneration of languages at Babel, where now we have multiple languages, and we have an introduction of difficulty in communicating. We can't communicate with those that we can't understand their language. And I think what God did at that point is he interrupted the self-centered technology of mankind. In other words, mankind was getting to a point that, in fact, the text tells us that there'd be nothing that would prevent him from going further into evil. So he broke up the technology, and man basically has to go into it. And I think you can put a Stone Age in there if you want to. I think it fits very nicely that to survive, not everybody knows how to build a house, so you have to perhaps live in a cave for the winter to shelter yourself. So That's another interruption in language. So Babel is not the origin of languages. It goes even before man because God speaks.
Yeah.
And
That's a
God
great thought.
God builds language into Adam because Adam doesn't learn. There's already a communication in Genesis 2 between God and.
That's a great thought. And then we come to the end, almost to the end. Hebrews 1. God spoke and revealed Himself in many portions in many ways, but in these last days, He has spoken to us in a Son. And just what a way to communicate.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, sir. We definitely appreciate your time. We appreciate your expertise, and I could do this all night, but
Well, let's have another session. Let's have session 4 here.
yeah, there we go. Well, if you want to communicate or continue your communication with Dr. Mondragon, his website is forhisglorynm.com, and that's posted on Facebook. Also, go over to graceabroad.org. And Grace Abroad was the organization that put all this together, and setting up the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, ISBH. And we're just grateful for them, grateful for all of our speakers today, and for Dr. Mondragon, who closed us out with these last 3 sessions. And so thank you so much, and hope hope everyone found it beneficial. And we will close out, and have a good evening wherever you are. And we hope to see you in the future at another ISBH event. Bye.
Thank you.